So now, let me. So this is basically this was just the background for general developments in the financial services industry. Let's now talk a little bit about how financial services work. And the most basic financial service that I can think of is a payment. That's essentially payments are the backbone, and as I said, any financial service in some form or another requires some form of wire transfer. So now let's go with the normal commercial transaction where Bob on the right hand side wants to sell Alice on the left hand side his car. And what Alice therefore has to do is she has to give him money. How is this going to be done? Now, normally she could do it by cash, but cash is, of course, for a big item, it's not something we do. Nobody wants cash, especially not in COVID times. So what is the step to do? What can we do? Well, you go via your bank. You do some form of wire transfer, use a credit card, use all kinds of these services. So let's think about how these transfers work fundamentally. Okay, cash transfer is straightforward. You give it face to face. Cash is legal tender. You can check what it is. You have full security over it. Fine. Now, if you go via bank, the easiest is a situation where Bob and Alice both use the same bank account. Now, when they use the same bank account, it's very straightforward for the bank. All that they have to do is they have to change the ledger entry for Alice, take money out of her account, and increase the ledger entry for Bob at the same time. Straightforward, simple. And in fact, actually, the first credit card payments work exactly that way, where a bank, the Bank of America, tried to enroll both customers and merchants to use their systems to make payments. And of course, you can see that doesn't work when people want to bank with the different banks, and effectively, most people in the US, for instance, never had access to the Bank of America because they didn't operate in every state. So now let's go back and forget about that for a moment. But just think about how does it work actually when you have to have a transfer where Sue and Bob, okay, I called her Alice before. Let's now rename her to Sue, where Sue and Bob bank at different banks. Well, the simplest version again is one where Sue's bank and Bob's bank actually have accounts with one another. And that is something which actually happens quite frequently. Right? So, but if they have an account with one another, all that they have to do is, that Sue has to take money out of her bank account and puts it into Bob's bank's bank account, and then sends a message to Bob's bank and says, "Hey, I made a transfer for you, so would you mind?" And then so they take it out of their own account at their bank and put it into Bob's account, because that way the accounts all balance out. Now that's also relatively straightforward, way to arrange it, but you can see already it requires a lot more messages. In particular, it requires that there has to be reconciliation messages, right? Because every time you do one of these steps, you have to tell the other side that's what you just did, so that the other side knows where the money went and whether or not the money has been received. Now, most cases, however, banks don't have accounts with one another. In the US has several thousand banks, and clearly they can't all have accounts with one another. So this is why we have a central bank. In fact, actually, the story for central bank goes further back. There's a very famous example where somebody wants to send a check from Long Island in New York to New Jersey, which is, as the bird flies, maybe 10 miles distance. And this, in the old days, it took people, something like 10 days for the check to clear. And I remember there was an example where somebody estimated that over 100 different financial institutions were involved, where basically the check went from one institution to the next to the next. So it always went from institutions that had accounts with one another. So they had to string them together. Now that's extremely inefficient, and for that was one of the reasons why we have central banks. Because what a central bank is, essentially it has a central ledger, and in that central ledger, it can, it can arrange transfers from one bank to another. So all of the banks have an account with a central bank, and then you have these internal transfers that happen at that bank, and that's it. Right? So in this particular case, what would have to happen is Sue's bank transfers money from its own account to the bank's bank account. Then it goes to the central bank, and the central bank it gets notified that they have to transfer money from Sue's bank's bank account to Bob's bank's bank account at the central bank. And once that transfer has happened, the central bank then notifies the Bob's bank that the transfer has occurred. I mean, I'm simplifying here, right? But you can see that there's a lot of different processes involved. Now you have three entities involved. The central bank, this is an elaborate process. It requires its own data system. And of course, in particular, what happens is that a lot of reconciliation messages are required here again. And now again, this is also something which only works in one country. If you think about the world as it is today, we live in an international world. Many of you maybe have relatives that live in other countries. You may have the need to send money around. And at the end of the day, you know, so the way I think of myself is, even though I'm a Canadian, I always think of myself also as somebody who, you know, has a lot of contacts all over the world, who likes to travel and, you know, have business all over the world. So, you know, there's only so much that I find it's always very irritating that the financial services sector is so country-centric. Now, international transfers are, again, a whole other level of complicated, because then you have to use the so-called SWIFT network. The SWIFT network essentially is a network of corresponding banks. And when I just explained to you the idea of sending a check from New Jersey or from Long Island to New Jersey, it has to go through various different banks. Well, that's essentially what the SWIFT network is, right? So it goes through a network of corresponding banks that then send the money around. Now, to be clear, the SWIFT network is a large network which many banks can can tap into. The banks that actually do the transfers is just a small number, right? I don't know exactly what the number is, but it is not every bank in the world is involved in every single transaction, so in many transactions. It's really just a small network where the money gets shifted around. And it's a pretty complicated process. And you know, there's a lot of friction involved. It is very expensive because, you know, when you need to touch multiple different ledgers, there's a certain set of risk in every single transaction. There's a reconciliation that has to be made. It's difficult within the SWIFT network to know where the money actually is at any given point in time. And so that creates a huge degree of uncertainty, and you know, slow payments, generally speaking, are a problem for people. Now here's just one example, just to show you the complexity. This is something which I took from Randy Rottenberg's slides, who I understand will also teaching your class on payment systems. And you can see this is basically the organization, if you want to call it that, of how payments work in Canada. So there's various different payments channels, there's very different types of payments, and many of them use various different systems. And you know, they use different settlement systems, they use different, you know, clearing systems. It is quite complicated, and complicated usually means cost, right, and risk. So the crazy thought, of course, is, so bottom line of this whole analysis is it's very complex. There's many different parties involved that you all have to trust in the process, by the way. It is very expensive, and there's lots of frictions and points of failure that exist. So now, wouldn't it be therefore crazy? I mean, here's a crazy thought. Could we not do the whole thing by having a common resource, right? So where, you know, all the transfer happen on a single type of ledger. Is that something that we can envision? And is it something that can be done? And well, there are, for payments, of course, solutions like that already. So if you think of China, for instance, they have WeChat Pay and Alipay. You know, Apple Pay in the US tries to set something up like that too. Or you have PayPal. PayPal in and by itself is also a system where you basically have a single ledger for arranging types of payments. Of course, there's lots of problems with this. You have power concentration, you have potential monopolies. There's also a question of overseeing the risk, right? Because at some point these payment systems become so important, they become systemically important. So if they would fail, the entire economy would not be able to work, right? So you have to, there's all of these concerns out there. And that's not really what I want to talk to you about. What I want to talk to you about is the idea of a distributed ledger or blockchain technology, where the idea is essentially is that there's just a joint single resource, which is a shared resource, or if you want, you can think about it as a common infrastructure. And it has the features that it allows the secure storage of information and transfer of value. And it has also, and this is the cool part about it, it has programmable money. So it has a guaranteed execution of code. You know, thinking about a contingent contracts, think of a derivatives contracts, think of a bond, for instance, you know, where you have automated payments being made. So essentially the money that you have can be programmed to do certain things. And, you know, the promise here is that it will be an open platform that has global reach and allows near frictionless finance. So that's basically what we're after. And this is what I want to talk to you about.